Deuteronomy chapter 21. So if you have your device, your Bibles, I'd encourage you to open them up because our class study for today is around miscellaneous laws, which means there's a lot of things that we'll potentially be looking at. The class actually kind of covers chapters 21 through 25. We won't really have time to do like we normally do and actually kind of read all of those. There's a lot of different ones that are in there. I will try to highlight specific ones that I think are pertinent to us today and try to help us kind of see different things. So really the goals for the class today is to really kind of look at a couple of the laws here that kind of help us recognize that there's this concept of loving your neighbor. And the world of what Moses was doing, he was kind of setting up these laws that kind of talked about justice and righteousness, but that also included this idea of loving your neighbor. And then we'll kind of look at the laws that kind of help us see Jesus today and some of these laws that were back in Deuteronomy chapter 21. So just as a quick reminder, again, we're in Deuteronomy. They're at the east side of the Jordan. They're about to enter into the promised land, and Moses is giving his final sermon, and he has an opportunity to explain to this new generation of people that are about to go into the promised land how they are expected to live once they're in there. And he wants them to be successful and to be able to be righteous and separate and apart and look different than the people that were actually in there. Because God's people are called to be holy, and he explains that to them in there, and that it says that you are children, that you are the children, and because you are the children of God, there's this expectation that you should be just and righteous. And he starts to begin to do all of these laws that kind of set up these civil officials and things that we talked about in the past couple of classes, and he's going to give them a king, one that can rule over them, and he's going to give them this prophet and judges and priests and things. And one day a prophet just like Moses is going to come and kind of come rule with them. And then he begins, Moses starts to begin to give this picture of what life is actually going to look like once they go into the promised land. And last week, H.E. started talking about these cities of refuge. And real quick, it was just a couple of reminders here that if you were to accidentally kill somebody, that they had set up these cities that you can go and kind of flee to in order to protect yourself. Is that you weren't guilty of murder, you didn't actually do it on purpose, and so you had this opportunity to flee to these cities because there was these individuals that were, I guess, assigned. I didn't realize this, but H.E. mentioned that there were these individuals in these families that were assigned, I guess, specific, the avengers of the families. The avengers of blood, I think is what it was called. And so they were assigned that if anything happened to the family, it's like they were supposed to go and take care of it. And so in order for these individuals that accidentally potentially killed somebody, they didn't actually do it on purpose, they were to go and flee to these cities to protect them from these people. And they were doing that because they wanted to give them some time to have a fair trial. And there were actually a lot of rules that kind of dictated these just trials that were supposed to happen. There were laws that were around that you had to have, at least 2 or 3 witnesses, and they wanted it to be just and done fairly, so that people had this opportunity to stay alive, and they were protected by the high priests that were in those cities. And so you had these cities of refuge, and we talked a little bit about how that kind of related to our spiritual refuge that we see in Jesus. Our refuge is in Jesus. And the interesting contrast about if we were to apply it to a spiritual nature is that these individuals that were going or fleeing to these cities were innocent people. They didn't commit murder. They were going there to find protection. But whenever we flee to our city, our spiritual refuge within Jesus, we are sinful people. We know that we are guilty. We know that we still need that protection. But we're, going to Jesus because he died for us, and we recognize that we need that protection. And the innocent man that was fleeing to these cities, within these cities of refuge, he was allowed to go to these, and the idea was so that he could live. And the only innocent man within our scenario with Jesus and with us is that Jesus was the innocent man, and he was the one that was condemned to die for us, and so that we, the guilty, can live. And so there was this interesting contrast when you think about the cities of refuge back in Deuteronomy versus how we look at it from a Jesus perspective as a spiritual refuge. And also there was some notes in there around the high priest. If the high priest, the individuals were actually allowed to stay there within the cities, and they were protected because the high priest provided that protection. And it wasn't until that high priest died that that individual was allowed to leave. And if he left, wasn't real sure what happened to him, but he was able to leave the city. But our high priest, being Jesus, he never dies. And so he is always interceding for us. We are guilty, and he's always there to intercede for us to God. So any questions or concerns or comments around any of that? Okay. Let's see. Well, let's get, I think, into our study. So go ahead, open up your Bibles. We're going to kind of look at this first 9 verses of Deuteronomy 21, and it's really around the concept of what they do in the event that there's this unsolved murder. And so as we read it, I'd encourage you to kind of see what steps were supposed to be taken, what is it that they're supposed to be doing, and we'll ask questions about it after we read it. But starting in verse 1, it says, "If anyone is found slain, lying in the field in the land which the Lord your God has given you to possess, and it is not known who killed him, then your elders and your judges shall go out and measure the distance from the slain man to the surrounding cities. And it shall be that the elders of the city nearest to the slain man will take a heifer which has not been worked and which has not pulled with a yoke. The elders of that city shall bring the heifer down to the valley with flowing water, which is neither plowed nor sown, and they shall break the heifer's neck there in the valley. And the priest, the son of Levi, shall come near, for the Lord your God has chosen them to minister to him and to bless in the name of the Lord. By their word, every controversy and every assault shall be settled. And all the elders of that city nearest to the slain man shall wash their hands over the heifers whose neck was broken in the valley. Then they shall answer and say, Our hands have not shed this blood, nor have our eyes seen it. Provide atonement, O Lord, for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, and do not lay innocent blood to the charge of your people Israel. An atonement shall be provided on their behalf for the blood. So you shall put away the guilt of the innocent blood from among you when you do what is right in the sight of the Lord." And so the first question is, what instructions were related to these unsolved murders? What did they have to do? And you just kind of blurt it out. Sacrifice a heifer. What else did they have to do? Break a neck through the sacrifice. Yeah. Find the nearest city. How did they find the nearest city? Measured it. Yeah, kind of interesting. What else did they have to do? Anything else? What's that? Wash their hands. They had to kind of go through this scenario or these talking points of washing their hands and saying, ask for atonement, basically. So yeah, a lot of, if they're innocent, right? Yeah. So verse 2, it says they had to measure the distance to find out which elders of those cities actually had to do this ritual. Whichever was the closest, wherever they found that body, that was those elders of that city. The closest city had to go and kind of do the rest of these steps here. You had to find a heifer, which hadn't been pulled, I guess. It hadn't pulled anything, hadn't been on the yoke, hadn't worked. And you had to break that neck of the heifer in a place in the valley that hadn't been sown, hadn't been plowed. They're in verse 4. And the elders, as Cecilia said, had to wash their hands of it and say that our hands have not shed this blood. And then at the end, they were asking for this atonement. They were asking, do not lay this blood to the charge of your people Israel. And so there was these certain steps to kind of follow in these unsolved murders. And in a way, I think that this particular example here kind of shows us a little bit of God's grace, because if you think about how they were getting atonement for their sins or their forgiveness for what was happening, there's really nothing that man can do that can ever earn God's forgiveness, right? There's this heifer, you can kind of see that it was never worked. It had never been on the yoke. The ground that they were actually going to kill it on had never been sown, had never been tilled. And the priests, the judges, and the elders, they really didn't have to do anything outside of just saying a couple of things and maybe doing certain sayings within the ritual. And I thought it was interesting. Did any part of this story kind of remind you of anything within the New Testament? Anything that they were doing, did it remind you of any story within the New Testament? Nothing? Jesus washed the feet, yeah. What else? Any other stories that what the elders were doing? Possibly, yeah. What did Pilate do? Wash my hands, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, unblemished. Yeah, there's an unblemished part. We'll definitely get to that. But Pilate washed his hands. He said, I'm innocent of this man's blood. And in the same sense, there was these elders that said, over the heifer's neck, I've washed my hands of this blood. Granny? Yeah, didn't reference that at all. Yeah, they just kind of killed it. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. The other thing that I kind of thought that was kind of in contrast to what we see happening in the crucifixion story was that the elders in this story, they were asking for atonement and saying, don't put this blood on your people Israel. But if you recall how the elders responded to Pilate whenever he was saying, I washed my hands, he said, yeah, his blood be on, the elders were yelling back at him saying, Christ's blood be on us and our children. And it was just an interesting contrast that I saw between the story in Deuteronomy versus what they were doing here. And the heifer, as you were saying, was this innocent animal that hadn't done anything, hadn't worked, hadn't sown anything, and in a way, I felt kind of represented Jesus died sinless and kind of prayed for the people. So, any thoughts or any comments on any of that, or any concerns with any of that before we move on to the next couple of verses here? Okay, this next section, it's a little bit further down. It's around this idea of a rebellious child. It's verses 18 through 21. And again, just, kind of as we read through it, and it kind of went well with what Steve was saying this morning in his sermon, but kind of as we read through it, see just what we're supposed to do and kind of the characteristics and things like that, and we'll kind of walk through that. But starting in verse 18, chapter 21, it says, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city, and they shall say to the elders of his city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones, so you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. So it'd be interesting if we still had that rule here today for a lot of our kids. But what was the characteristics of the child? Drunkard? Glutton? Rebellious? Argumentative? Wouldn't obey? Also said, I don't know what your translations say, but he said he was stubborn. He was rebellious. He wouldn't obey, a glutton and a drunkard. What was to be done to this child? Killed. He was supposed to be killed. Prior to being killed, what was it said that was done to the child? But prior to being stoned, what does the story say? He was taken before the elders, yeah. Anything else you see in there? He was chastened. He was disciplined, all right? Shows that his parents attempted to try to discipline him, They attempted to try to show him the way. They tried to tell him what was right and wrong, but he still, didn't do anything. Eventually, they had to take him to the elders. Eventually, they ended up doing, taking him and stoning him to death. Can we learn anything from this story about God and what he thinks? What's that? Sorry. His judgment? What, unwavering judgment. I didn't get the first part. I heard the judgment. I didn't get the unwavering. Unwavering judgment, yes. What, you going to say something, Brian? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we'll definitely get to that. Um, Mike, you got something? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's yeah, it's funny. I think you're reading my my thing here because a rebellious child, regardless of age, is unacceptable to God, and that's what I think we can learn here is that rebellion, and all throughout Deuteronomy, he's telling them, do not rebel. Listen to my commandments. Listen to my commandments. Look what your parents did when they rebelled, and all through it, he's trying to help them understand that rebellion is not going to be accepted by God. And to Mike's point, there's a lot of times that we as parents can sometimes make up these excuses for our kids to say, well, boys will be boys. It's like, how teenagers are. They're going to grow out of it. But the point here is that there has to be this first line of defense to say that we need to discipline our children, that we have to be able to say something to them and help guide them in a way. And that's, I think, a lot of the things that we can recognize from this. But regardless of the age, there's going to be this rebellion that's not going to be tolerated by it because it's kind of shown over and over again in Deuteronomy. But I think one of the difficult things that can be said, and I think Steve is going to do a lot better job of it than what I'm trying to say here, is that parenting is difficult, and we can do all the right things. We can take them to church, we can do all the right things and try to teach them, and we can discipline them, but there's still going to be children that still rebel. And it's not going to be anything of our fault, I think, but there are techniques of parenting that can lead children to rebel. But if we are trying to do what is right, if we're trying to do these things and trying to do that, it's not a foolproof plan that our child is not going to rebel. So, any thoughts, or did that stir up anything in anybody to want to say anything? Brian?
The new covenant deals with rebellion in a little bit more humane manner, as best I can tell. Mm-hmm. But obviously, God has given to each one of us the right and the authority of free will. By the way, I can't find that term in Scripture, but He has given us the right and the authority to conduct ourselves the way we want to. We can choose to obey God or choose not to. And of course, you got a number of proverbs talking about how if you train his child upright, he will not depart. But we know that that's just a general rule, and there's plenty of exceptions, and I've seen them. I've seen children raised in the church by good parents and faithful children at the time depart, and I've seen others who were not raised in the church and just got a glancing taste of the Word of God and were baptized and were faithful the rest of their life. It's a mystery of the Spirit. And but this does show that God doesn't like rebellion. I guess what we need to look at is as us rebelling against God our Father, as opposed to a physical son rebelling against his physical father.
Good point. Anything else? Okay. We'll move into chapter 22, and we start getting into this concept of loving your neighbor. And in the midst of all of these things about righteousness and justice, there's still this act of that kind of includes this understanding that we need to love one another and how we treat each other. So let's read chapter 22, verses 1 through 4. It says, "You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray, and hide yourself from them. You shall certainly bring them back to your brother, and if your brother is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall remain with you until your brother seeks it, and you shall restore it to him. You shall do the same thing with his donkey, and so shall you do with his garments, with any lost thing of your brother's, which he has lost and you have found. You shall do likewise. You must not hide yourself. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down along the road and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him lift them up again." And so I think these particular verses are really kind of show us what we would call this Good Samaritan rule today. Back then, I don't think there were a lot of fences, and so animals were had a tendency to kind of stray off, and so they were kind of just everywhere. And so the idea here was that if you were to find it, you were supposed to return it and give it back to them. But it wasn't just limited to animals. It was really applied to anything of your brother's. If you were to find it, you were either to hold on to it if you didn't know how to get it back to them until they came and looked for it, and then just return it, as it said there in verse 3. And it says, but I think Jesus kind of expanded on this in the actual parable of the Good Samaritan. And if you think about, well, how did he expand on it? If you were to think about what Jesus was kind of talking about in the parable of the Good Samaritan, what was different about what's being said here? What was his parable about? Y'all remember the parable of the Good Samaritan? They robbed him, yeah, and what? Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Well, I think the parable of the Good Samaritan is really to love your neighbor, and the question posed, therefore, who is your neighbor?
Right.
And so you have this Samaritan, of course, who is a Gentile, who gets robbed and injured, and along comes, no, I take it back. It was the Samaritan who gave care for the person who was robbed and injured, and a priest came by, Levi came by, the best of the religious cult that passed this man by, and it was the lowly Samaritan that who provided love and care.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely helped them recognize that, your neighbor it kind of expanded this idea of who your neighbor was and helped them recognize it wasn't just your brethren within the Israelite nation. It kind of went on to the Samaritans, the people that they were at heads against. And it also kind of helped them recognize that it wasn't just about animals or things that you were trying to take care of. It was about people. You were trying to help people just in general, to take care of your brother, to love your neighbor, to do these things. And, it's just, in a way, Jesus' point here within the Good Samaritan almost kind of takes it from this physical understanding of, how you take care of people, but almost this concern for souls of people and the concern for, us as individuals. So I do want to kind of just real quick kind of point out verse 5 here within chapter 22, just because of the things that we kind of deal with today. Chapter 22, verse 5 says, "A woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on woman's garment, for all who do so are abomination to the Lord your God. And I think, this verse kind of, it kind of tells us that God intended for this gender distinction to be maintained. By him, the very means of him kind of saying this kind of shows us that there is such a thing as man's clothes versus women's clothes. And so I think it's sad that in our society today is that they're trying to do everything that they can to kind of blur this distinction or erase this distinction between what a man is and what a woman is. And to God, that's just not how it should be at the very beginning. And this verse is kind of ingested in between all of these things within the rest of chapter 22 that talk about sexual immorality, specifically around before you're married and after you're married. And I think it really kind of goes somewhat well with it, because at the very beginning, God made man and female. And so in order to kind of go along with this idea of marriage and the sanctity of marriage and the purity of marriage, it kind of goes along with a lot of the stuff that kind of the rest of chapter 22 kind of talks about. And just real quickly, there's verses 13 through 18 talks about not having any sort of false accusations around, the wife that you just married. 22, 21, 23 show that there's a lot of different types of sexual immorality, but all of them kind of result in death. And then the verse 28 kind of talks about penalties of raping a virgin, and verse 30, there's no incest allowed. And all of these are just around trying to keep this purity of marriage, this marriage covenant, and trying to make it pure. Let's see. Yes.
So I feel like, I hope I'm not like stirring the pot too hard right now, but like I feel like in the Church of Christ we pride ourselves on keeping context and about like reading the Scripture as a whole, like keeping everything all together. And I feel like as I was kind of reading ahead and came across verse 5, which you just addressed, and thought, well, that's really explicit. I mean, that if there was ever any kind of strong argument, that's a very explicit argument right there. But if we take that seriously within context, then that also means that we should not be wearing material of mixed wool and linen together, and we should make for ourselves tassels on the four corners of our garments, which we cover ourselves. If one is important still today, if that argument on verse 5 is just as applicable today, then doesn't that imply that we should be taking the arguments on all of those verses seriously? If one is true, then they all should be true. If one is not true, then they all should not be true.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious on people's thoughts on those
Well,
things.
my only thought that came to mind when you kind of said that was like, I think that's the only verse that I've ever read. You're supposed to wear tassels and things like that. But there's verse upon verse that talks about man and woman, female, male, and talks about, you're not supposed to do this, man on man, woman on woman, and it supporting that idea that you shouldn't try to make people think that you're that. And I don't know if that's the answer that you're looking for, but if it's just like, that's that one verse, and maybe it doesn't apply to us about the tassels anymore. I don't know. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts around that, but.
For example, I don't know that that's a sign of being effeminate. But clearly we know when dresses are worn, and, well, we just need to look at the news and what's going around in our culture today and see the abominations of transsexuals that this nation has fallen for.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes, mate.
I just think it's more of a clear understanding of what women wear and what men wear. A man that walks around with a shirt that's off the shoulders, it's just not appropriate. And it just you can just tell that they want to go crossing that line. So I think it's just boundaries. Yeah, there would be men things that kind of, sway a little bit different, like a little tassel on it, but when you're just trying to go the extra of, trying to make sure your shirt's low or your shoulders are showing. I think that's the difference.
Well, and to be clear, like I'm not arguing that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think I understand that.
That's not the point I'm trying to make. But I mean, and I don't know how many of you guys like in your lives live in a world where you have to argue these points, but I really, really do.
Yeah.
Frequently. And so if I were to bring this verse up to someone else to say, look, this is very clear and verbatim, they will say, well, okay, well, 4 verses later it says this. Do you do that? And I would say, well, no.
Yeah.
I mean, and to say, like, if I'm like, I can't just say, well, look around the world, look at how bad things are. Like, to them, that's not a fair argument.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to use scripture to make an argument here, then I have to be able to justify the whole. So I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not arguing against whether men should wear women's clothes. That's not that's not the argument I'm making. So
Yeah. Mitchell has something he wants to say.
I think also we need to think about the Old Testament versus the New Testament, because there's many things that they had to practice in the Old Testament that we're not practicing now. But there's many things that do carry over, and you can kind of differentiate in what we do now from the New Testament after Jesus came.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're not doing sacrifices and everything exactly word for word.
Yeah. And that was kind of my point earlier about, there's a lot of references to that same idea of what verse 5 is trying to say, and there's more than just that one verse of the tassels in comparison, I guess. Do you want to say one last thing before we move on?
In the old law, by the new covenant, you'll see that it's the ritual aspects, the physical aspects of the religion, the physical tabernacle, the temple, the feasts and the festivals and so forth. All that was done away with. But I can say, I'll have to research it further, but as a general rule, if not an absolute rule, that all of the moral instructions of the old are carried over into the new, and in fact, even more strongly, more intense. For example, rape in the old law was consummation of the act, whereas the new law just making the intention in your heart to do something like that, you're guilty. But one thing that the society's got so confused on is the homosexuality. When it comes to dress, you can pretty well tell when somebody's trying to portray themselves as being a different gender than their birth, biological birth. I think it's more obvious with men, obviously, because women can look feminine wearing pants and shirts. You're out, you're doing things. Where with the man putting on a dress and makeup and stuff, it's far more obvious. But nonetheless, we understand when people are trying to look to adopt a gender that they're not. And that's a sin. And just it is.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't anticipate us talking about that much. I just kind of put it in there. But thank you for the question. So as we move into chapter 24, I think it's important for us to, be reminded about, what God had intended for the marriage covenant and the purity that God wanted for that marriage covenant. Because when we read these first 4 verses of chapter 24, it's you kind of start questioning, well, what's really happening here. So let's read verses 1 through 4 of chapter 24. It says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanliness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is given you as an inheritance. And so my question, wow, that went pretty fast. What do we know about what God thinks about divorce? Doesn't like it, right? Is there any one way that we can divorce? What was that? Fidelity, adultery. Yeah, there's only one reason for a divorce, right? And so is it confusing to immorality? Is it confusing to kind of see a law from Moses that kind of shows certificate of divorces and rules around that? And yeah, he sure did. It was to me. I thought it was like, well, what is he talking about? But then to Brian's point, is it showing that divorce is okay? I guess was my next question. Is these verses showing us that, well, if there's a rule around giving a certificate of divorce, is that saying that God approves of divorce? Is he? Hmm. Well, I don't know. I guess that's an interesting question. I was going to get into all of those points, but yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Well, the way Jesus answered it is that it was not this way from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The man had his wife, and the wife had her man, and the two became one flesh. And then he clarifies, no man can rent asunder that which God has joined together. And that would be not only a judge or a juror, someone else in authority, but that'd be the husband and the wife themselves. They don't have the authority to separate themselves. The marriage ends at death or upon this immorality. And if you want to get into difficulties, then define what that immorality is. And let me assure you, as an elder, you got to start dealing with that, then you get real problems.
Yeah. The only thought that came to mind for your question, Lee, it's like God allows us to sin. Does that mean he's okay with it? No. And so I think in the same sense here, it's like he allowed it, I guess, to happen because of the hardness of their hearts. But does that mean he's okay with it? I don't think so. I don't think that really this whole section of this was not around this certificate of divorce. It was really to help stop this particular scenario of the defilement of the actual woman. It wasn't to help them recognize, if you have this thing, you can do this with the certificate of divorce and get away with it, and do this with the certificate of divorce. And that's not what that was all about. It was really to help this defilement of the woman and stop that. What ends up happening was that they were reading this law as just this justification to say, well, we can divorce for any reason. And they saw that there in verse 1 because it says, because he found some uncleanliness in her. And they said, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, does that mean that I can just, whatever I dislike about her, I can say, hey, well, here's my certificate of divorce? And I said that, but then these verses aren't showing that God is okay with it. And to Brian's point, Jesus actually answers this question to the Pharisees because the Pharisees wanted to test Jesus and ask him, well, what do you think about this? Because Moses was given a divorce, and we can read it, but we're actually kind of running out of time. But in the end, Brian kind of said it in a very quick summary. The reason that this was all happening was because of the hardness of their hearts, that it says there in verse 8. And from the beginning, it wasn't like that. In the very beginning, God did not make this marriage covenant to be to where you could do all of these things and divorce however you wanted. That it was originally man and female, and it talks about there in verse 5, that's why they leave their mother and their father, and they join to become one. And it was never supposed to be that way. But I'm going to stop you because there's one point. I don't know if I wanted to get to this, because I think this is what kind of... Okay, there's a pearl of wisdom that we have from Brian that we can go on.
Divorce and marriage, when you consider that marriage is a prophetic figure of relationship of Christ to his church. And who is his bride. And so you see the faithfulness of Christ to his church, and you see the bride, which is the church's faithfulness to the husband. The two are joined. We're joined to Christ at baptism. The church is joined to Christ, which is his body. Therefore, you can see the consequences of violating that figure of that relationship when a man joins himself to another woman or a woman joins herself to another man.
Okay. So I wanted to focus, kind of back up a little bit to chapter 21, because there's these few verses in chapter 21 that I just want to kind of focus on for a moment, because I think it gives an interesting connection to the New Testament. It says, if a man has committed a sin deserving of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. For he who is hanged is accursed of God. And my intent was to kind of lead y'all through this, but we're running out of time, so I'll just kind of quickly go through this. But in these verses, we see that there's these rules and regulations around crimes that were punishable by death, and and if you hung them on a tree, there were certain things that you were supposed to do. He was not supposed to be there all night. You were supposed to bury him that day, and leaving the body out all night would defile the land. And we actually see other verses in chapter 23 that talk about God walking amongst the camp, and that you're not supposed to defile the camp, and there's other things about purge the evil from the camp. And so that theme kind of goes along with this particular thing. But the verse that I wanted you to focus in on was this: for he who is hanged is accursed by God. Anyone that kind of goes through this sort of death is considered cursed by God, and it was something that they were very familiar with. And so in Galatians chapter 3, Paul actually quotes this verse to make a point about Jesus. He says, for all who rely on works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by the things written in the book of the law and do them. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by law. The righteous live by faith. But the law is not of faith. Rather, the one who does them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. And there's our quote. So that in Christ Jesus, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. And so when we start asking this question, it's like, well, why did Paul quote this scripture in Deuteronomy and associate it with Jesus? Well, if you think about when that law was given in chapter 21, Moses was kind of explaining this law, and it was in the midst of all of these other laws around justice and righteousness. And he wanted that to be there so that people would follow it, so it would protect people, and you would have this system set up, and that the people would live righteously. But then Paul comes along and applies this law to one of the most unjust things that happened in our human history, and that was related to what happened to Jesus on the cross. It was there you have the perfect Son of God who has become a curse for us. A perfect Son of God who did nothing wrong, who was not defiled of anything, did no evil, and yet he was treated as someone that was convicted of a crime deserving of death and being hung on a tree like he was, or hung on the cross. And this hanging symbolized this being cursed of God. And so Paul here is kind of showing us, that Jesus took on this curse for us, and kind of helps us to recognize how this curse was applied, at least, and how the people at that time kind of saw this whole incident happening. And so we can kind of see this also being prophesied in Isaiah 53, there in verse 4, where it says, surely he has been born of our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. And so I think I felt like I got this different perspective of what was being said, or at least the way that it caused people to kind of look at him, because as people were walking by, every person that saw Jesus on the cross and kind of related him to this being accursed by God, it kind of gave me a different perspective when we reread all of the mocking and the things that they were saying in Matthew 27. You kind of get this different way of what they're saying to him. So let's just read, I'll skip down to verse 42 because it says, he saved others, he himself, he cannot save it. If he is the king of Israel, let him now come down from the cross and we will believe him. He trusted in God, let him deliver him now if he will have him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And so if you put this understanding of how they looked at people being hung on the tree as being cursed by God, you kind of almost feel this different attitude about what they were saying there in Deuteronomy. They're saying, how can you be the Son of God? How can you say that you have a relationship with him? You are Deuteronomy 21. It says, you are hanging on a tree. You are clearly accursed of God. Your death, the way that you are dying, symbolizes this curse of God. But Paul helps us understand that the reason that we are not cursed, the curse that we deserve there in verse 10, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all these things written by the law and do them. And Jesus was really the only one that ever abided by all of those things perfectly, yet, he was the one that died for it. He was the one that died a curse and thought he was deserving of it. I have a lot more to say on this, but all the kids are coming in. I'm getting distracted, and so I think we'll stop there. But it's just I think a beautiful connection to what was happening to Jesus and how we can see it even in Deuteronomy chapter 21. So study it on your own, and y'all have a good rest of your day.